The wind came in at 30 below, not the kind of cold that bites, the kind that kills without warning, that seeps through every layer of wool and cotton and rubber and reaches the marrow before a man even knows it's happening. The kind of cold that turns rifle oil into paste and freezes the action of an M1 Garand solid in the space of 20 minutes. The kind of cold that makes a man question whether his fingers are still attached to his hands because he cannot feel them, and he is not entirely sure the answer is yes. That was the Korean peninsula in the winter of 1950, and on a nameless ridgeline in the central highlands, 70 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army were already moving through the darkness toward an American outpost that held fewer than a dozen men. One of those men would account for 45 of them before the night was over. This is not a story about heroism in any clean or comfortable sense of the word. This is a story about what a human being is capable of when everything has already gone wrong, when the cold has stripped away every advantage, when the night has swallowed every landmark, when the enemy is close enough to smell, and the only thing left between survival and death is the willingness to keep moving forward into the dark. To understand what happened on that ridge, you have to understand what the Korean War actually was, because the version that survives in American memory is a pale and sanitized thing compared to the reality that the men who fought it carried for the rest of their lives. Korea is sometimes called the Forgotten War, wedged as it was between the moral clarity of World War II and the defining national trauma of Vietnam, and that designation has always been an insult, dressed up as a geographic observation. The men who fought in Korea were not forgotten by anyone who mattered. They were ignored, which is a different and more deliberate thing. The war began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a coordinated armored assault that shattered the Republic of Korea's military within days and sent American and United Nations forces into a desperate fighting retreat that nearly pushed the entire Allied force into the sea at Pusan. General Douglas MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon in September of 1950 reversed the momentum of the war with stunning speed, and by October, American and South Korean forces were pushing deep into North Korea, approaching the Yalu River that marked the border with Manchuria. And that was the moment when the nature of the war changed entirely. China had been watching. Mao Zedong had been issuing warnings through diplomatic back channels that if American forces approached the Yalu, the People's Republic of China would intervene. Those warnings were dismissed by MacArthur and by officials in Washington who believed that China would not risk direct confrontation with the United States. They were wrong. In late October of 1950, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army crossed the Yalu River in massive numbers, not in a few divisions, in hundreds of thousands of men, moving primarily at night, hiding during the day, using the terrain of North Korea's rugged mountains to conceal their movement from American air reconnaissance. By the time American commanders had a clear picture of what was happening, the trap was already closing. The battles that followed in the winter of 1950 and into 1951 represent some of the most brutal, sustained combat in American military history. The Chosin Reservoir, the Imjin River, the battles along the Naktung. These were not engagements fought in the neat back and forth of conventional warfare. These were night attacks in temperatures that killed men who stopped moving. These were positions overrun by human wave assaults that came in such numbers that the mathematics of ammunition versus attackers became a genuine operational concern. These were soldiers who woke up to find the enemy had infiltrated their positions in the dark, who fought at ranges measured in feet rather than hundreds of yards, who used rifles as clubs when the mechanisms froze and the magazines emptied, and there was no time to reload. The Chinese military doctrine of that period was built around several interlocking principles that were specifically designed to neutralize American advantages in firepower and air support. The People's Volunteer Army moved at night. It attacked at night. It infiltrated defensive positions in the darkness and attempted to neutralize command structures and communications before the main assault began. The bugle calls that American survivors described with such consistent terror were not ceremonial. They were a command and control system. Different calls signified different tactical instructions. and the sound of those bugles floating through the frozen darkness of a Korean night was both a communication tool and a psychological weapon. The Chinese commanders understood that the sound of bugles coming from multiple directions in the dark, combined with the disorienting effect of muzzle flashes and grenade bursts in a pitch-black environment, would create a level of confusion that could paralyze even experienced soldiers. The cold was a force multiplier for all of this. American equipment of that era was not designed for sustained operation at temperatures that regularly dropped to 25 and 30 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The M1 Garand, the standard American infantry rifle of World War II that remained in widespread use in Korea, required lubrication to function reliably. In extreme cold, that lubrication congealed, and the weapon's semi-automatic action would either slow dramatically or cease entirely. Soldiers learned to fire their weapons dry, without any lubricant at all, accepting increased wear on the mechanism in exchange for reliability. But the magazines still jammed. The firing pins still occasionally snapped when struck at extreme cold temperatures. The Browning automatic rifle, the squad automatic weapon that American infantry depended on to lay down suppressive fire, was particularly vulnerable. Its gas-operated action required tolerances that simply could not be maintained when the metal itself was contracting in the cold. Men carried their weapons inside their sleeping bags at night, pressed against their bodies, using their own body heat to keep the mechanisms warm enough to function. They tucked grenades inside their jackets. They kept spare ammunition in their armpits. None of this was enough. It was never fully enough, because the Chinese kept coming. The engagement that this account centers on took place during a period of intense Chinese pressure along a sector of the front that had stabilized into a brutal, grinding positional warfare after the initial catastrophic reversal of late 1950. American and United Nations forces had absorbed the shock of the Chinese intervention, retreated in some cases, and fought their way through encirclement in others, and had eventually established a line that approximated the original 38th parallel. The fighting that continued along that line was not the dramatic sweeping maneuver warfare of the earlier phases of the conflict. It was trench warfare. It was outpost warfare. It was the same piece of frozen ground changing hands multiple times in a single week, purchased and repurchased with lives on both sides, neither army able to deliver a knockout blow, both armies unwilling to accept any settlement that felt like defeat. The outposts were the cutting edge of this warfare. Small positions, sometimes no more than a reinforced squad of 10 to 12 men, dug into hilltops and ridgelines that had tactical value for observation or for controlling avenues of approach. These outposts were often positioned well forward of the main line of resistance, separated from reinforcement and resupply by terrain that was difficult in daylight and nearly impossible in the dark. They were connected to the main line by telephone wire that was routinely cut by Chinese patrols and by radio communication that the cold made unreliable. The men who manned these positions understood that in the event of a serious attack, help would be slow in coming. They understood that they were, in practical terms, on their own. The American soldier at the center of this account had been in Korea long enough to have lost count of the nights. He had arrived as part of a replacement draft that fed men into units that had been badly chewed up in the fighting retreat of the previous months, and he had learned the particular curriculum of this war quickly and without sentiment. He had learned that the cold was not an inconvenience, but a tactical environment that required constant active management. He had learned that the Chinese patrols that probed American positions every night were not testing randomly, but gathering information systematically, mapping the gaps in wire obstacles, identifying the positions of machine guns by the sound of their fire, locating the routes that could be used to infiltrate the perimeter without triggering the trip flares that American engineers placed with such care in the approaches to their positions. He had learned that when the bugles started in the dark, you did not wait to see where the attack was going to develop. You assumed it was coming at you and you acted accordingly. On the night in question, he was among a small group manning an outpost that sat on a piece of high ground that the army had given a designation on a map, and that the men who lived on it had given a name that reflected their feelings about the position with considerably more feeling than the Army's alphanumeric system allowed. The position had been reinforced with wire obstacles and with a number of crew-served weapons, but the cold had already exacted its toll on the unit's equipment over the preceding days, and what existed on paper as a combat-capable position was in practice somewhat less formidable. Some of the automatic weapons were operating with reduced reliability. The telephone wire to the main line of resistance had been cut by a Chinese patrol 2 nights earlier, and the repair team had not yet been able to reach the position. Communication with the main line was dependent on a radio that worked when it wanted to work, and on runners who had to cross open ground in the dark. The night began the way most bad nights in Korea began: quiet. The specific kind of quiet that settles into a position when the wind drops, and there is no ambient noise, and you become conscious of just how far from anywhere you actually are. The kind of quiet that does not feel like peace. The kind of quiet that feels like something is being held very still in the dark, waiting. The men on the perimeter maintained their watches with the mechanical discipline of soldiers who have learned that staying awake is not a matter of willpower, but of procedure. You stayed in physical contact with the man next to you. You reported in on schedule. You kept your hands moving if you could, flexing your fingers inside your mittens, pressing your trigger hand against your body to keep some warmth in it. You watched the darkness, and you listened to it, and you tried to separate the sounds that were wind and the sounds that were animals from the sounds that were men moving carefully through the snow. He heard them before the trip flares went up. A sound that should not have been there, a compression in the snow that was different from the random settling noises that a man learns to filter out over weeks of standing watch on frozen ground. He was already moving to wake the nearest sleeping man when the first flare caught, and the darkness went white, and the Chinese soldiers were there, much closer than they should have been, too close. Close enough that the sight of them was physically startling, even though he had known on some level that they were coming. There were more of them than the flare could fully illuminate. The white light of the trip flare cast hard shadows, and the human shapes in those shadows were overlapping, packed close together in the assault formation that the Chinese used to compress as many men as possible through the gaps in the wire obstacles before defenders could bring fire to bear. 70 men is a precise number, and the precision of it should not obscure what 70 men actually look like when they are moving at speed toward a position in the dark. They look like something that cannot be stopped. They look like a force of nature rather than a military formation. They look like the specific and absolute end of everything. The automatic weapons opened up, both of them for a few seconds, then one of them jammed, then the other. The cold had won its argument with the gas-operated mechanisms, and in the span of 5 seconds, the defensive fire of the position went from suppressive to nothing. The Chinese assault wave did not slow down. It accelerated, because the soldiers leading it understood that the silence of those automatic weapons represented the moment they had been trained to exploit. What happened next was not a battle in any orderly sense of the word. It was not a firefight that could be diagrammed on a tactical map with clear arrows and objective markers. It was close-quarters combat in near-total darkness on a piece of ground that had already been partially overrun, and the man at the center of it made decisions in fractions of seconds that he would not be able to fully reconstruct afterward, because the processing speed required by the situation exceeded the capacity of conscious memory to record it in any organized form. He knew his rifle was working. He had kept it warm, and he had fired it dry, and it was working. He knew that the position was being overrun from at least 2 directions simultaneously, which was consistent with Chinese infiltration tactics that used small penetration teams to enter a perimeter from multiple angles before the main assault arrived, creating interior confusion that made it impossible for defenders to orient their fire without risking hitting each other. He knew that the men closest to the wire were already engaged at hand-to-hand distance, which meant that aimed rifle fire in their direction was no longer an option. He moved, not toward the wire and not away from it, but laterally, along the reverse slope of the position where the terrain gave him some protection from the incoming fire that was now coming from multiple directions inside what had been, minutes ago, a defended American perimeter. He was counting. He was not counting consciously in the way a man counts objects he is deliberately enumerating. He was counting the way an experienced soldier counts, the way a man counts the seconds between a lightning flash and the thunder, automatically, the number accruing in some part of his mind that runs parallel to the part that is making decisions about where to move and when to fire. The rifle was a close-range weapon in this fight. The ranges involved were measured in yards, sometimes in feet. The technique he used was not the careful aimed fire of the rifle range, but the rapid, instinctive fire of close combat. Front sight on a shape in the dark. The shape registers as hostile because everything in front of him at this range is hostile. Press the trigger, move, acquire the next shape, press the trigger. The sound of the weapon firing in the cold air was flat and hard, a sound with no echo in the frozen darkness, each shot a distinct percussion. His hands were cold, but they were working. His bolt was cycling. The magazine was running down, and he changed it without looking at his hands, by feel, the same way he had trained to do it. The Chinese bugles were sounding. Multiple bugles, different calls, the tactical language of an army that had learned to operate in conditions where voice communication was unreliable and where the noise of combat swallowed everything. The calls were relaying instructions that he could not interpret and that he therefore ignored, treating each new movement in the dark as a variable independent of whatever command structure was driving it. A man moving toward him in the dark was a problem with one solution. A bugle call was information that did not change the nature of that problem. He moved through the position. The spatial geography of the fighting had reorganized itself in the way that close combat always reorganizes a position, into a patchwork of small engagements and momentary stillnesses and sudden violent action that made the idea of a coherent defensive line meaningless. He found two of his own men in a fighting position that was still intact and was exchanging fire with a group of Chinese soldiers who had worked their way up onto the crest of the ridge. He coordinated with them for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough to direct their fire, to identify where the largest concentration of the assault force was located, and to communicate that he was going to move around the flank of that concentration. He went alone. Not because he chose to go alone out of any theatrical impulse, but because the tactical situation did not give him another option. The men in the fighting position were needed where they were. There was no one else. He went alone in the dark around the flank of the Chinese assault force, moving below the military crest of the ridge, where he was below the silhouette line and could not be seen against the sky, moving through snow that was knee-deep in places and that sucked at his boots with each step, moving in a crouch that his thighs were screaming about before he had covered 50 yards. He came around the flank, and the assault force was there, close, and they did not know he was there because their attention was directed forward, toward the position they were attacking, and the noise of the assault itself covered the sound of his approach. He was close enough that he could hear voices. He was close enough to smell the distinctive smell of the quilted cotton uniforms that the Chinese soldiers wore, an odor of wood smoke and sweat, and the particular smell of cotton that has been wet and dried repeatedly. He was close enough that when he began firing, the muzzle flash was visible to the men on the other side of the position, and they could not immediately identify what it represented because it was behind the assault force, and no one fires from behind their own men. The rifle worked. It kept working. He kept moving. He moved constantly because a stationary target in a firefight, even in the dark, becomes a fixed point that can be identified by the flash of the muzzle and eliminated. He moved and he fired and he changed magazines and he moved and he fired again, and the assault force, which had been organized into a coherent formation with a clear direction of movement and a clear objective, began to lose its coherence because something was killing it from behind, and the soldiers in the rear of the formation could not identify the source, and the soldiers in the front of the formation could not stop the attack to deal with it. A grenade landed near him. The concussion was significant. He was knocked down and his ears were ringing, and there was something wrong with his left arm. Not a wound that he could immediately assess, but a dysfunction, a reduction in its reliability that he registered and filed and acted around because there was no time to investigate it. He got up. He kept moving. He found his rifle where it had fallen in the snow, verified it was operational, and kept moving. The bayonet was used. Not once. The specificity of close combat in the dark and the specific geometries of the fight at this point in the engagement are not something that can be described with clinical precision, because clinical precision would require a degree of distance from the event that did not exist. What can be stated is that he used every tool available to him. The rifle when it fired, the bayonet when the rifle did not have the range, his hands when nothing else was applicable, the cold ground and the leverage it provided, and the weight of his own body as an instrument of force. The Chinese assault began to fragment, not all at once, not cleanly, but the coherence of the formation was gone, and a formation without coherence in the dark is a collection of individuals rather than a military unit, and individuals in the dark who have lost contact with their command structure and cannot identify the source of the fire that is killing them tend to make decisions that prioritize survival over objective. The attack had been designed to overrun a fixed position. The attack had not been designed to deal with the specific situation that had developed, with a single defender who had gotten inside the formation and was moving through it, and who showed no indication of stopping. The bugles changed. Different calls. He did not know what they meant, but the effect was observable. The pressure from one direction decreased, then another direction. The Chinese soldiers were not routing in any panicked or disorganized sense. They were withdrawing in the systematic and disciplined manner that the People's Volunteer Army had trained for, maintaining contact with their units, pulling back to a rally point that their officers had designated before the attack began. This was a professional army, and it withdrew like one. He let them go, not because of any decision about proportionality or restraint, but because his rifle was empty and his last magazine was in the weapon and partially expended, and following a withdrawing force of unknown size into the dark outside the perimeter would have been the tactical choice of a man who had stopped thinking. He stopped moving. He stood in the snow in the dark and listened to the sounds of the withdrawal diminishing, the crunch of boots in snow getting farther away, the bugle calls becoming more distant, and then, eventually, the specific silence of a position where the fighting has stopped. He made his way back through the position. He found the men who were alive, and he found the men who were not. He found the two men in the fighting position on the crest of the ridge, and they were alive, and they had exhausted most of their ammunition, and one of them had a wound that was going to require medical attention before frostbite complicated the diagnosis. He got on the radio and he reported the engagement. The radio worked. This was not guaranteed. The voice on the other end of the radio asked him to repeat the casualty count on the Chinese side, and he repeated it, and the voice was quiet for a moment before acknowledging. The count that he reported, and that was later verified by the after-action assessment, was 45 Chinese soldiers killed within the perimeter and on the approaches to it. The verification was not a precise science. The counting was done in the morning when the light came back and the bodies could be examined, and the attribution of specific kills to specific defenders was the work of assessment rather than of direct witness. But the consensus of the after-action process, the physical evidence of the positions where bodies were found, and the trajectories they indicated, was consistent with what he had reported. His left arm had a hairline fracture of the ulna, most likely from the grenade concussion. The fracture had not prevented him from operating his weapon throughout the engagement. It was treated at the aid station behind the main line of resistance, and he returned to duty within a week. The outpost was resupplied, and its automatic weapons were repaired, and it continued to occupy the same piece of frozen ground that it had occupied before the night of the attack. The Chinese forces in that sector continued to conduct probing and infiltration operations. The war continued.